people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
To the mother relay, we're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, and now it's time for our weekend recap. We're going to kick it off with Demetrius Andrade's venture into the men's super middleweight division opposite the ring. Journeyman Desmond Nicolson, who went the distance with him. Fight went the full 10 rounds.
Demetrius Andrade got off to a fast start the same way that he normally does. Looks like he wanted to make a statement.
Not dissimilar from what we saw in the Liam Williams fight well over a year ago. Scores an early knockdown, puts punches together. He definitely wanted to get the guy out of there, but Demetrius,
He's never been a big puncher. He may be good for an early knockdown, but not an early knockout.
who has stated he tried to make a statement, which in my humble opinion is a bit difficult to do opposite the ring, a Desmond Nicolson, to where even if you do knock him out, even if you do get him out of there early, what does it really mean?
In the greater scheme of things.
Things got interesting in the 5th round where Desmond Nicolson was seen putting punches together.
It looked a lot like he scored a knockdown of his own, but the referee ruled it a slip.
Though Demetrius was clearly sat down on his back pocket off a punch, a sequence of punches from Desmond Nicolson. Nevertheless, it did not count.
Wasn't ruled a knockdown, but it should have been.
I have to be honest, for all the hyperbole associated with Demetrius Andrade and some other fighters, one in particular that he's been pursuing for a long time, I don't see a fighter in Demetrius Andrade that beats Canelo Alvarez. I see a sloppy fighter, a messy fighter, a fighter that lacks punching power.
The whole time I was watching this thing, that was the only thing on my mind.
Guy looks bang average.
Ordinary.
And off balance, winging big shots, attempting to score a knockout, but failing to do so. I mean, I don't see a fighter in Demetrius Andrade to where Canelo Alvarez has anything to worry about.
In spite of what he might think, and in spite of what the handful of supporters he has might think.
No matter how much they try to talk him up, when I look at this guy, I see a guy that Canelo stands a better chance of beating than a Dimitri Bivol.
This is intended to be the beginning of Demetrius Andrade's super middleweight campaign.
And now that he's gotten this rather forgettable fight, this formality out of the way, the question then becomes, how long before they get him back out there? And when they get him back out there, who's it going to be against? Hopefully not another Desmond Nicolson kind of guy.
Caleb Plant and David Benavidez is supposed to be fighting each other very soon, so that rules the both of them out.
Jermall Charlo's been out of action well over a year, and I hardly think that his very first fight back is going to be Demetrius Andrade. There is Cuba's own David Morrell, but for Demetrius, that's a high-risk, low-reward guy.
What kind of money would it take to get Demetrius Andrade in the ring with that guy when he swerved Yanni back?
Taking on David Morrell, an unbeaten super middleweight with considerable punching power and a decent pedigree, is an even taller order than taking on a Yanni Bek Alimkhanalai.
It's just hard to imagine that fight happens.
I really don't know what's next for Demetrius Andrade. This formality fight, this tune-up, was a necessary evil in some ways because Demetrius himself sat out all of last year.
But now that he's banked these rounds and he's gotten this out of the way, it really is hard to know who's he going to fight next, when's it going to go down.
This was a forgettable fight, it was.
It's not even that Demetrius looked bad per se, though, getting sat on his back pocket the way that he did in the 5th. That doesn't help things any.
Hard to wrap my mind around all of this. An inconsequential fight.
A pretty ho-hum showing.
There was nothing that happened in this fight to call your mother a bop.
Congratulations, you beat Desmond Nicolson on points.
We then come to Rashidi Ellis' upset loss to Roman Villa in the men's welterweight division. Rashidi Ellis, who got off to a decent start, and I had him winning most of the early rounds in the first half of the fight.
He did.
Maintaining distance, creating space, beating those feet, and pumping out that jab.
He was looking good, but it was noticeable that he couldn't put a dent in Roman Villa.
He was landing clean, but in spite of that, he couldn't keep the guy from barreling forward and trying to crowd him.
Power isn't everything, but you need to have at least enough power to get the guy's respect, to make him think twice about busting through the front door, and Rashidi Ellis clearly couldn't get Roman Villa's respect.
Rashidi didn't have enough power to keep him off or keep him out. And the fact that Rashidi was so consistently backpedaling, circling away from his opponent as opposed to turning him and walking him into punches that he doesn't see.
Something akin to what you see from Sonny Edwards or a Vasil Lomachenko.
So often in this sport, plain old backpedaling is often confused with fancy feet, fancy footwork, when all you're really doing is giving up real estate because you can't hold the center of the ring and you don't want to trade.
You don't want to engage. In some circles, this is confused with fancy footwork, when really it's just a guy who's retreating.
After a while, that's all Rashidi Ellis was doing, as he was clearly being outworked by Roman Villa. The damage had started to set in. Rashidi himself started to slow down, and he was taking punishment.
Folding under the pressure Roman Villa was applying.
Now I see why he didn't fight Virgil Ortiz. If this is what Roman Villa did to him, could you imagine what Virgil would have done?
It was the pressure that got to Rashidi.
He started off all right, though, being forced to work and being forced to move as much as he had to move in order to create space between himself and Roman Villa. It eventually wore on his gas tank.
And not having enough power to keep Roman Villa off of him and get his attention put a dent in that guy to try to slow him down.
We see it all the time. It's not dissimilar from what we saw a few weeks ago in the Barrett versus Rakhimov fight.
A pure boxer might look all right in the early goings of the match, in the early rounds while they're still fresh and the damage hasn't set in, but round by round,
the pressure is getting to them. Fighting on the balls of their feet, not sitting on their punches, not engaging.
Is just not enough on their shots to keep the other guy off.
In order to create separation, and what distinguishes an A-level pure boxer versus a B-level pure boxer is how they manage the distance.
What separates the men from the boys?
There's a thin line between creating space and retreating. There's a thin line between creating space in order to set the guy up, walk him into a trap, a counter shot, and flat out running, flat out retreating.
People often confuse this for having fancy footwork, having fancy feet.
But just moving lateral don't mean you got fancy feet. Fancy feet is pivoting and turning the guy, then walking him into a shot. Something akin to what we saw in the Sonny Edwards versus Felix Alvarado fight.
Something akin to what we saw in the Bam Rodriguez versus Sor Rungvisai fight.
The act of creating angles, not just creating space.
Not everybody does this, and not all pure boxers are created equal.
In the case of Rashidi Ellis, he spent a good amount of time just backpedaling and circling away because he couldn't hold the center of the ring and he couldn't stand his ground. He didn't want to engage, didn't want to sit in the pocket with Roman Villa.
He's not cutting angles on the guy, pivoting to hit him in the blind spots.
So it was what it was. Eventually, Roman Villa's pressure got to Rashidi Ellis. I saw Roman Villa land a mammoth left hand that sat Rashidi Ellis on his back pocket. I think he dropped him about 2 or 3 times.
It was a tale of two halves. The first half you had to give to Rashidi Ellis, but
Roman Villa rallied back in the last half.
And the right man won the fight. Roman Villa, a Samson Lukowicz fighter. Samson Lukowicz does a lot of business with the PBC.
Can only deduce that we can expect to see more of him. Rashidi Ellis has just suffered his first professional loss. He got found out.
It was only a matter of time.
Swerving the Virgil Ortiz fight, eventually swerving the Jaron Boots Ennis fight. He got found out.
It was only a matter of time.
Thought he could coast on easy street, protect his unblemished record, and he finally ran into somebody that wanted it more than he did.
Because when you're coasting on easy street for too long, that's what happens.
We then come to the co-main event, to the main event, the welterweight contest, the IBF eliminator between Jaron Boots Ennis and Karen Chuka, yet another guy who took a more defensive approach.
Another guy who didn't want to engage and as a result lost the fight.
Now, Karen Chuka did well to stay out of harm's way. He was hell-bent on surviving, but in terms of scoring blows or winning rounds,
Clearly wasn't trying to do that.
simultaneously, this was not the best advertisement for Jaron Boots Ennis being the wrecking ball that he's made out to be. It reminded me of the Igis Kavaliauskas versus Ray Robinson fight, to where Ray Robinson's constant movement, the fact that he wouldn't sit still, he wouldn't fight, he was more comfortable backpedaling.
I remember after that fight, a lot of people said Mean Machine didn't look good. I didn't think Jaron Boots Ennis looked good here.
On the premise that he was opposite the ring a fighter who wouldn't stop moving and wouldn't engage. It affected his power in all the ways that Ray Robinson's constant movement affected Mean Machine's power. It's the same underlying principle. You're dealing with a moving target who's just comfortable surviving. He's not trying to win these rounds.
Pivoting to stay on the outside of Jaron Boots Ennis's jab as Jaron Boots Ennis would shoot it.
And rolling with Jaron Boots Ennis's backhand whenever he did bring it over, Jaron Boots Ennis was unable to land meaty punches, meaty, meaningful shots.
Couldn't do it.
Though because Jaron Boots Ennis was the aggressor and the only one exhibiting anything semblant of a work rate, he did win this thing wide for the same underlying principle.
Same reason.
For the same reason that Igis Kavaliauskas beat Ray Robinson. It's because the other guy, the defensively minded guy, is comfortable fighting only half a fight.
The guy on the fly, he's not fighting on the fly.
He's just on the fly, slipping, rolling, bobbing, weaving, moving, pivoting. He's doing a lot of things, but what he's not doing is mounting any offense.
Not enough to win the rounds anyway. You did see Karen get off a couple of punches here and there, but nowhere near enough to give him the rounds.
He clearly knew not to sit in the pocket with Jaron Boots Ennis. He clearly knew not to engage. He was quite content fighting half of a fight.
Karen went the distance.
Not the greatest advertisement for Jaron Boots Ennis, though I will say I think he exhibited good cardio, being able to keep the pressure on Karen Chukatsian for as long as he did.
I think he's got a good gas tank.
Though not the greatest feat. Hard to say that Jaron Boots Ennis was able to cut the ring off Karen Chukatsian, who stayed on his bike the majority of the fight.
He did.
Jaron Boots Ennis was unable to pin him down and land meaty punches, meaningful shots.
Dealing with a moving target took something off his power.
It often does. Dealing with a moving target requires a bit more finesse, a bit more sharpshooting than perhaps Jaron Boots Ennis is accustomed to having to dish out at this stage in his career. Look, the kid's talented. You can see he's got a ceiling.
But you can also see that he needs work. You should be able to.
Not that long ago, Virgil Ortiz was opposite the ring, an unbeaten up-and-comer who's also a moving target, a southpaw in Michael McKinson. And Virgil Ortiz was eventually able to find him in there. Find him and stop him. Jaron Boots Ennis was unable to do that to Karen Chukatsian last night.
Yeah, he was able to move him around the ring a little bit. He was able to outwork him in a manner of speaking, though he was unable to find him, to land big punches, really big punches, big shots to slow him down and take him out.
It's not the worst thing in the world that Karen Chukatsian took Jaron Boots Ennis the distance, because he does need to become more accustomed to fighting in a 12-round fight. You're not going to be able to stop every guy early.
The guy only fought for 4 minutes last year. He needed to bank those rounds, and maybe some of what we saw was ring rust.
Perhaps it was. Thus, it's not the worst thing in the world that Jaron Boots Ennis fought for 12 yesterday. Hopefully he fights more than once this year.
Congratulations to him. He's now in line to challenge for the red belt. Challenge for the IBF title.
That takes care of the monotonous co-main event to the main event that ended in a rather anticlimactic way.
The main event between Gervonta Davis and Hector Garcia, the lightweight contest for what was the WBA regular title.
A few perspectives. Beating Hector Garcia, a WBA super featherweight champion, up there at lightweight where he hasn't proven anything.
It's quite jarring, the hyperbole associated with Gervonta Davis, who's really not fighting the upper echelon lightweights in his division. I mean, Yuriorkis Gamboa, Isaac Cruz, Rolly Romero.
A journeyman, two guys that haven't beaten anybody, and now a guy from super featherweight.
Albeit a champion, he hasn't proven anything as a lightweight, thus beating him there doesn't really mean that much.
And how he beat him has given rise to some critiques, some criticisms. Let's talk about what we saw. In the early goings of this fight, I felt that Hector Garcia, he showed good ring generalship. He showed a good jab, shooting that jab,
though not stepping into it,
to maintain distance between himself and Gervonta, the smaller guy. Hector being a little taller and a little longer, it was quite savvy.
Employing the lead hand in order to maintain distance and make Gervonta Davis have to work for his meal.
Subtle movements from Hector Garcia as Gervonta Davis tried to find his way around that jab, inching forward. Hector Garcia taking a half step back.
Maintaining distance.
Gervonta Davis having the faster hands of the two. He wasn't fully able to capitalize off that speed advantage outside of the pocket, but inside of the pocket, you could see he's the faster guy. He just needs to be close to Hector, though getting close to him took some work.
You could argue that the first round was an even round, though the subsequent subsequent rounds that followed, rounds 2 and 3, I gave Hector Garcia those rounds,
making the judges' actual scorecards a bit hard to reconcile. For me, at this point, it seems almost farcical to try and score a Gervonta Davis fight, as the man opposite the ring isn't likely to get a fair shake, and his work is not going to be appreciated or reflected in the match.
I saw Hector Garcia win at least 4 rounds. At least 4.
He's managing the distance well in the early goings of the fight, using his height, using his reach, using his jab, and taking a half step back should Gervonta Davis try to barrel forward and crowd him.
And in those moments where he did interesting exchanges, though you could clearly see Gervonta Davis has the faster hands of the two and the heavier shots, the heavier punches.
Finally, taking the initiative after a few rounds, you saw Gervonta Davis looking to slip past that jab, close the gap on Hector Garcia, and get inside the pocket.
Take it to him.
He had some success in doing so, some success with that.
He did have the more eye-catching shots and spots, the more eye-catching punches, though Hector Garcia throughout seemed to have been holding up and holding his own all right.
Most of the fight he did, though. Perspective is key. Hector Garcia is not thought of as being of the same ilk as a Devin Haney or a Shakur Stevenson or a Vasyl Lomachenko, so you have to keep that in mind whenever a fighter like this has any success at all.
That if a Hector Garcia was able to effectively manage the distance, at least in part, opposite the ring of Gervonta Davis, what could a Shakur Stevenson do? A slightly taller, longer, younger fighter with a better pedigree,
speed of his own, counters of his own, and better feet overall than a Hector Garcia. Essentially, what would happen if Gervonta Davis were in the ring with a better fighter than a Rolly Romero, a better fighter than an Isaac Cruz, a better fighter than a Hector Garcia? What would happen?
Because Hector Garcia, God bless him, he ain't the same caliber of fighter that Shakur Stevenson is.
And even if the judges' scorecards don't necessarily reflect the success that Hector was having, people know what they saw.
They saw Gervonta Davis struggle to get within striking distance of Hector Garcia, trying to jab his way in.
He wasn't able to, not at first. He had to tweak his strategy, decided to focus on slipping the jab, getting under or around it, and then letting punches go. And it worked for him.
But the fight's anticlimactic ending, Hector Garcia basically retiring in his corner on the premise that his sight was at least temporarily impaired.
That's what he said. He said he couldn't see, at least temporarily, though by the time they gave him the post-fight interview, he was right as rain.
The commotion out in the crowd in the 8th round,
disrupting the fight, something to do with Gary Russell Jr. and his brothers and some other party that was in attendance, delaying that round.
Hector himself not showing signs of swelling, not being cut, not being dropped, yet not coming out for the 9th round,
claiming that he was, at least in part, temporarily blinded by a hard shot that landed in the 8th round. It all left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths.
I tell you, it wasn't a funny-looking fight, but it was a funny-looking ending.
Funny enough that people are starting to question what's really going on here, though. Irrespective of conspiracy theories, the bottom line is Hector Garcia isn't an upper echelon lightweight anyway, so beating him there
doesn't mean much.
Irrespective of how you do it, nobody considers Hector Garcia as being of the same ilk as a Devin Haney, a Shakur Stevenson, or a Vasyl Lomachenko anyway.
It is what it is.